Section 4. The practical working of the Protestant systems. The character of Luther, like that of most true Teutons, was compounded of hearty joviality and deep sadness. It has often been remarked that the latter element, which was inseparable from his conflicts and his vocation, painfully predominated in his later years, in which one might have hoped there would have been serenity, if not sunshine. Romanists and many who are not Romanists have said that but one inference can be drawn from such a fact. He felt a bitter sense of disappointment in the result of his labours. If pride had permitted him, he would have confessed that he had rashly and sinfully entered upon them. Such observations are very plausible, and very convincing to those who fancy that a man commences a work, like that to which Luther's life was devoted, from some calculations of producing an effect that will redound to his own satisfaction, or profit, or honour, or even to the advantage of the world. He cannot be governed by any such calculations. No one to whom mankind really owes any great gratitude was ever governed by them. A mighty power which he must obey is urging him forward. At every step there is reluctance. Oftentimes he says to himself, "I will speak no more words in his name." He is ashamed and confounded that one like him should pull down and destroy, but the fire is in his heart, and it must come forth from his heart, whatever it consumes. A man who obeys such an impulse will have much sorrow in himself, and will be little understood by others. All he can say in his own defence is, "I know this was to be done and that I was to do it." Men will tell him that a knave might use the same language. He will admit it, and will only answer, "Whether I be a knave or no, I do not stand before your tribunal. My judgment is with the Lord, and my work is with my God." It will be time for the Romanists to say that Luther did not accomplish anything which he wished to accomplish, or which his time required, when they are able to explain without reference to him the extraordinary change which took place in the morality and energy of their own hierarchy in the generation following. It will be time for Protestants to sneer at Luther, when they have fully ascertained that every step out of the errors which they deplore in their own systems will not be made most effectually when they understand the spirit in which he acted, and enter into it, and whether every attempt to set aside the principles which he promulgated will not establish the evils of those systems, and strengthen them by the addition of others from which they may have been separated. The fact, however, must not be concealed. Luther did feel that Protestantism in every form, even that form which he had been the means of establishing, would not be an adequate or faithful witness for the truth which he had existed to proclaim. It was not merely that he foresaw a loss of the freshness and fervour by which new converts are wont to be distinguished. He felt, though he might not be able to find a reason which satisfied him for the feeling, that there was something in the idea of the evangelical church which would involve the necessity of great practical contradictions. Experience has justified his fears, and faithfully used, may perhaps assist us in discovering the ground of them. As soon as a body was expressly established for the purpose of asserting the doctrine of justification by faith, the confessions and formularies which set forth that doctrine began of course to be in the highest esteem. They were the casket which contained the jewel, and the jewel could not be preserved without the casket. It was all very well to say the creed contains it, or as Luther would say, he that can declare I believe in God the Father etc. is justified. But the Romanists acknowledge the creed too, and we are to defend justification against the Romanists. It was still more unsatisfactory to say, the Bible contains the doctrine. The Romanists acknowledge the Bible. The Bible, interpreted in a particular way or not interpreted in another way, might seem to deny it. Consequently, a certain interpretation of the creed and of the Bible must be guarded and upheld. These formularies have been carefully worded to include that interpretation and to exclude every other. To these we must adhere. How to escape from an argument of this kind none could tell. It seemed perfectly conclusive. Nevertheless, in a very little time some men arose who said they had been deceived. You tell us justification is our bond of union, but it is not so. Justification is a living thing. The justification of which Luther speaks, and of which St. Paul speaks, means the deliverance of a man's conscience from a burden and a bondage. But the justification of which you speak means a notion or theory about something which you call by this name, which theory is contained in a certain document you call a confession. This will not do. The evangelical church is no church. It does not deserve its name, if it do not consist of men who are really justified. Moreover, the Bible, which is a real book, and speaks of the real justification, must be the book of the church, and not these formularies. Otherwise Protestantism is not Protestantism. The proclamation went forth, it was heard and felt to be true, the living preacher was followed, the dry doctrinalist deserted. But what is the living preacher to do with those who follow him? They are to form the true church. But how is it to be ascertained that they do form it? We must see that they really feel what they profess, that they experience this justification and do not merely use the name. Well then, there must be another set of tests introduced, and another set of books written to ascertain which of these tests are sound and which fallacious. And now comes another reaction. What it is said, and do you call this Lutheranism? Feelings, experiences, Luther abhorred the words, all Romanist imposture lurks in them. Luther set up his doctrine of justification as a witness against them. This proclamation also goes forth. It is seen to be true, men hearken to it. The preachers of feeling and experiences are pronounced unsound. Then what can we do but return to the good old way? The confessions regain their esteem. Believing these confessions must mean believing justification. There is no help for it. We cannot come at any other rule. The records of this series of reactions form the longest and most important chapter in the history of Lutheranism. But there is also another chapter. The ideas of imputation, satisfaction, representation were, I said, expressed to Luther in living acts of faith and devotion, in the Psalms, in the Creed and sacraments. Apart from these, he did not wish to contemplate them, though he might be compelled to do so by the necessities of controversy. But it was the business of his disciples to exhibit all these ideas, being inseparably connected with justification, in very precise and accurate expressions. The nature and mode of imputation must be described in propositions. It must be made clearly and definitely intelligible to everyone how the divine justice was satisfied. It must be shewn what is the amount and measure of sacrifice which was necessary for the deliverance of man from the penalty of sin. If these statements had taken the purely scholastic form which was given to theological propositions before the Reformation, it would have been seen that they were not, at all events, sufficient for men's wants, that there must be something else, since the gospel was meant for the poor. But the Reformation had, as we have seen, a peculiarly popular character. Protestantism addressed itself to common men. Even the books that were written for the preachers must have something of this character, as they were to deliver to the people the dogmas which they learnt. Hence these definitions and propositions became strangely mingled with popular illustrations. The language of the schools and of the world was blended into a most bewildering mosaic. Precedents and customs from the law courts, maxims of trade, the vulgarest proverbs of worldly men, were all pressed into the service of the sanctuary, and used to explain and defend the acts of him to whose righteous judgment all these customs and maxims and proverbs must at last be brought. And because in the dealings of men, what are really deep and true principles, sometimes, through misunderstanding or misapplication to purposes for which they were not intended, come to have the effect of fictions, and to be so regarded, and as fictions are praised and accounted clever by men who know not that any utility they may possess is derived from the original truth that is in them. These theologians of the semi-scholastic, semi-popular class introduced this habit of thinking into their own study, and taught their disciples to believe it nothing horrible that fictions should be attributed to the God of truth. I do not say that the temper I have described was more characteristic of the Lutheran or evangelical church than of the other Protestants, but it particularly affected the class of doctrines which that church especially undertook to defend, and the opposition to it was perhaps more marked in that than elsewhere. This opposition arose from the feeling that these dogmatic teachings had nothing to do with practical morality, nay, affected it injuriously. The Reformers had withstood the popish notion that family duties, national duties, the transactions of common life, were less holy than the services of the cloister. They had openly or implicitly discouraged the opinion that men who will renounce the ordinary routine of social life may hope to attain a peculiar saintship. Now their language was turned against the doctrines which they had bequeathed. Christianity, it was said, must have for its main object the inculcation of a pure, simple, and practical scheme of ethics. It could not be intended to introduce a theory more difficult or embarrassing than that of any heathen philosopher who had not professed to provide a gospel for the poor and ignorant. Least of all could it be made to contain notions respecting the ways, designs, and character of God, which actually contradicted all the notions of justice and benevolence which we recognize in ordinary life. As this tone of thinking diffused itself more and more widely, a set of maxims, partly appertaining to outward conduct, partly to the discipline of the temper, affections, dispositions, gradually shaped themselves out and were received as the essential part of Christianity. These became the main topics in the discourse of the preacher. It was the business of the schoolman to show how the Bible might be interpreted, not to mean more, or much more doctrines being freely interpreted, than these maxims. Some could satisfy themselves more easily than others that they had succeeded in this task. Those who were critically honest felt that there were great difficulties, that much of the Bible must be given up in order that the notions of their opponents might not derive a support from it. The precedent had been given by Luther himself. It was possible to believe that the carrying out of that precedent was the carrying out of the principle of the Reformation. Hence, the commencement of that form of rationalism which characterized the last age. It was a simple, practical, intelligible system, which the wayfarer who ran might read, that was demanded by these modern Protestants. But it was found by experiment that the wayfarer who ran did not read the scheme of Christianity which was thus presented to him. The poor men said that it had nothing whatever to do with them. This was a startling practical difficulty which led to results affecting Protestantism in all directions, and not merely the Lutheran form of it. But what I wish the reader to observe here is how little the body which took justification by faith for its motto and principle has been able in any stage of its history to assert that doctrine. How constantly the system, whether interpreted by earnest believers or stiff dogmatists, by orthodox doctors or mere moralists, has been laboring to strangle the principle to which it owes its existence. I cannot touch at present upon the later history of Lutheranism. It belongs to the records of a great struggle of which our time has witnessed the commencement and may witness the completion, whether the doctrines which the Reformers proclaimed are to be overcome by Romanism, to be merged in pantheism, or to find for themselves some surer basis than either. Some of my remarks upon Luther must of course apply to the Calvinistic bodies. Still they have features of their own, which are well deserving of a separate consideration. We have seen that the idea of an absolute will, choosing individual men out of a fallen world, is not merely recognized by these bodies, that it is actually the ground of their existence. What strength there is in that belief, what deep irresistible truth there is in it, has been demonstrated in all ages of the world, and certainly not least in the history of Calvinism. The same divine might, I dare not call it by any other name, which was permitted to go forth with the Islamite armies, when in the sight of Christians who had lost the faith that they were God's chosen and appointed servants, and had sunk into a low slavish unbelief of a spiritual presence and a spiritual kingdom, they proclaimed that God's will was still the supreme law, still the actuating spring of all human energy. That same might was given, as I believe not seldom, to the Covenanters of Scotland and the Puritans of England, when they dared to put their trust in a spiritual arm, and to mock at all human and material weapons which set themselves in opposition to it. God forbid that we should lose the lesson, which the records of their victories contain, or that we should deny that they were victories given to faith with whatever inconsistencies that faith may have been mingled. But there did lie in the heart of the Mahometan conquerors, mingled with the very truth which gave them all their power and to their understandings inseparable from it, a dark and desperate fatalism, which was to prove how unlike it was to this truth by the difference of its effects, which was to prove that the system of Mahomet, the system which owed its life to this principle, was a lie and was charged with a curse, not a blessing to mankind. The history of the Calvinistic bodies ought to show whether any similar fatalism be hid in their creed, and whether they owe it rather to the sound portions of that creed, or to the influence of a surrounding atmosphere, which they did not create and would have been glad to exhaust, that they have escaped from the same gloom and helplessness which has succeeded to that early vigour in the soldiers of the Crescent. The Calvinists on the continent, since their first establishment, have exhibited little of the energy which I have attributed to their principle. A Dutchman or a Genevese might ask me with a sad smile, to what period in the history of the Reformed Church I could point as affording the least illustration of it. But the conflicts of the Synod of Dort soon brought to light the denying side of the doctrine, and gave it the most evident predominance. The Arminian doctors set up, or seemed to set up, the belief of a will in man against the idea of election. The Calvinists began to set up the idea of the absoluteness of the divine will against the idea of a will in man. Dogmas and determinations came forth, perfectly adequate for the purpose of contradiction, utterly inadequate for the purpose of assertion. In the next age, the Calvinist found that he had got the notion strongly grafted into his creed and rooted in his mind, that he had not a free will. All that he had lost was the clear conviction that there was a divine will, and that he had any connection with it. Then began some of the same reactions as in the Lutheran body, men feeling that they wanted more than logical formulas about election, declaring that the sense and experience of a divine election was the condition of it, this declaration leading to tests for ascertaining who possessed that condition. Such tests again denounced as setting aside the very idea of absolute and unconditional sovereignty. A combination of the spiritual and dogmatic elements is found in the able Dutch and German commentators, who arose in the early part of the last century. But they resorted to that same method of illustrating the scheme of God by human precedents, which I have already noticed. The clear acute reasoning temper, which Calvinism especially fosters, detected the inconsistencies of it. The disciples of the Genevan reformer said that they were meant to be witnesses for simplicity, and that simplicity in forms ought to be sustained by simplicity of doctrine. The ethical system became universal, and Voltaire wrote to tell D'Alembert that there were few preachers in Geneva who believed a word of the doctrine which Calvin spent his life in propagating. I have expressed, in as strong language as it is possible to use, my belief that there was a vital and powerful element in the Scotch Kirk and in English Puritanism, which came out in the formation of the one, and in the conflicts of the other with our royalty and episcopacy. I am not anxious to qualify the assertion by dwelling on all the cruelties and meannesses, the alternate cringing to the state and insolent domination over it, which marked the history of Scotch Presbyterianism in the 16th century, or the intolerance and persecution which characterized the English assertors of religious freedom in the 17th. These indications may be attributed to the temper of the age, and to the evil lessons which the Calvinistical bodies learnt from our Church. It is more important to observe how these bodies testified for the principle which called them into existence after the motives to violence had disappeared. The difference in their position makes the experiment a fair one. The Scotch Presbyterian body after the Revolution was raised to the dignity of an establishment. The English sects acquired a recognized position in the country, but, as they boast, were not hampered by any state alliance. Moreover, the English Calvinistical sects were several distinct experiments as to the mode of expressing the principle which was common to them all. To the Presbyterians, it seemed that there was one general scheme or platform of polity laid down in Scripture for all the faithful. The Independent asserted the right of each distinct congregation to be its own lawgiver. The Anabaptist maintained that each individual ought to be conscious of his own adoption into God's covenant before he received the sign of it. In the doctrine of this last named sect, we clearly discern the idea which all were laboring to embody. Each of the others confessed that it was not a church, but the shell of a church, and the effort to become one. The Anabaptists believed that if they had not actually solved the problem how to make the professing body identical with the elect body, they had at least made the nearest possible approximation to a solution of it. In the period which followed the Revolution, we have the most numerous testimonies from their own authorities that a gradual decay of faith and doctrine took place both in England and Scotland. In the latter country, it was ascribed by all the older Covenanters to the convention with the government. The English dissenters can only account for it by the general temper of the times. What renovating principle there was in either, to overcome the effects of state influence or of the world's infidelity, does not appear. They both alike attribute the restoration of their old doctrine, and of something like their former zeal, to an action from without, to an action proceeding from a corrupt body, against which they were each protesting. The preaching of Whitfield in Scotland, of Wesley and Whitfield in England, we are told by Presbyterians and Dissenters, awakened a spirit which had been long dormant among them. But only one of these Oxford divines was a Calvinist, and his preaching was not at all of the kind which was likely to recreate a Calvinistical system. The quickening influence, however, being once imparted, these bodies began to require a doctrine. Just at that time an American divine appeared, who united remarkable strength of thought to an earnest spirit, and to what he believed was a profound veneration for the name and creed of Calvin. The Edwards version of that creed, or some modification of it, became from this time forth the recognized system amongst English and Scotch Calvinists. Now this system, just so far as it received its complexion from the piety of its author, is unquestionably an assertion of a divine will. The strength of Edwards' mind seems to have been derived from his acknowledgement of a distinct being, dwelling in his own absoluteness and awfulness. But that which gives his system the logical consistency which its disciples so much admire is his manner of dispensing with a human will. Man is a piece of mere mechanism, acted upon by a certain set of motives. He is not a stone, for he has certain affections and sympathies which are susceptible of outward influences. But the notion that he is capable of being determined from within is utterly repudiated. The very object of the scheme is to set it aside. But anyone who looks at the nature of that power, which the earlier Calvinists put forth in action, or who even attend steadily to their deeper utterances, must perceive not merely that they did recognize these inward determinations, but that the belief in them was the life-giving principle of their minds. Whether they could explain the connection philosophically or not, the idea of the divine will was inseparably involved with the energy and activity of their own human will. They realized the one in the other. This logical development of the Calvinistical idea has therefore the strange peculiarity that it stands in the most direct practical contradiction to that idea as it existed in the mind of Calvin himself, and of all who sympathized with him. I say practical, for this is no difference about words. In Scotland especially, the working of the new system has been very remarkable. Find any man who has drunk deeply into the spirit of Knox and the old Covenanters, and ask him what manner of doctrine he hears from the Scotch preachers generally. I do not mean of the Robertson school, but of that which is most opposed to it, whether it be essentially the same with that which he supposes was delivered 2 centuries ago. In one form of language or another, he will give you to understand that he is sensible of the most violent contrast, that the modern Calvinism is a compound, to which if John Knox has contributed 1 part, Thomas Hobbes has contributed 3. The consequence is, that a young man going from the house of his fathers to a Scotch university, passes by the most natural steps possible into the philosophical system with which the religious one has been leavened. He adopts it as the most consistent interpretation of the phenomena of the world. The idea of anything spiritual becomes lost in his mind. Afterwards, perhaps, he may take up some one of those philosophical theories by which his countrymen have endeavored to modify or subvert pure materialism and utilitarianism. But he takes it up as a theory merely. It has nothing to do with his life. The maxim of the other system reigns there, only the more undisturbed because it presents itself less formally and obtrusively. Then if he have a good hardy Scotch understanding, which though it may dally with abstractions has great sympathy with the palpable and the actual, he soon becomes weary of this child's play, and goes forth into the world to show by his successful management that he has not lost that sense of an individual importance and position which characterized his forefathers, though he may turn it to a different, and what he considers a much more profitable, account. I know well what noble minds there are in Scotland, in whom another influence from that which I have described is at work, and who think, with bitter pain, of the materialism which has crept over their land. But these have no dreams that the old faith can be restored. They speak with great reverence of the first age of their kirk. They denounce prelacy and the English Church with vehemence. They dwell with affectionate tenderness upon the patriarchal life and discipline which existed in the rural districts of Scotland, among the middle classes, but a short time ago, and which was at all events connected with Presbyterianism. But they acknowledge that the system is worn out, that it has no longer power to produce energetic action, deep thought, or a simple form of society, that it flourishes only while it has something to fight with, that the symptoms which it exhibits in its decrepitude are the consequences of evils and weaknesses which were concealed in it when it was in its best estate, that in that best estate it could not satisfy the wants of which they are conscious. What these wants are, and in what forms they have expressed themselves, are questions belonging to a larger subject, upon which we must presently enter. The present political crisis in the Kirk will be more properly spoken of when we touch upon its connection with England. The circumstances of the nonconformists here are still more involved with the circumstances of our own Church. Still, it is almost impossible to notice them as illustrations of the history of Calvinism without looking at them on their political side. As theologians, they have struck out no path for themselves. What philosophy they have is derived from Scotland or America. It is therefore precisely as bodies possessing a certain outward organization that they suggest any important topic for reflection. Of this fact they are themselves apparently sensible. They feel more and more that they exist to oppose and destroy certain institutions, which they find established about them. If we look at the sects separately, we find that they are confessedly not spiritual bodies, only bodies professing to include within them a certain number of spiritual individuals. We find new congregations arising out of the old, protesting that these have become earthly and corrupt, that the only hope of a pure church is in fresh division and secession. We find the members of the old societies denouncing these endeavors after an ideal perfection, and maintaining that experience has always confuted them. We find accounts given by their own members of proceedings resorted to in the election and deposition of ministers, and the formation of congregations, which are, to say the least, what men commonly call secular. We find these sects engaged in angry controversies with each other, the Pedobaptists, for instance, vehemently denouncing the Anabaptists, because they maintain the fearful heresy that immersion was the earliest mode of initiation into the Christian Church. We find the leaders of these bodies complaining of the great deadness of their congregations and endeavouring to produce revivals in them, by methods which seem to us of the most mechanical and material character. These are the indications which the different dissenting bodies present, when looked at separately or in their relations to each other. Is it wonderful that they should wish rather to fix our attention on the great united force which they are able to bring into play at public meetings, in vestry rooms, and in newspapers, against that which they name the secular anti-spiritual Church of England? Unquestionably, if she be secular or just so far as she is secular, these weapons may prevail against her, for that which is secular may be destroyed by that which is secular. If she be spiritual, they will be as powerless against her, as secular armor has always proved against a spiritual principle, whether it has come forth in Puritanism or in any other shape. But this is not the question now before us. It is whether the evidence furnished by the Reformed Church on the continent, the Presbyterian Kirk in Scotland, and the English nonconformist sects, tends to confirm or refute the notion that the Calvinistical principle is a sufficient foundation for a universal church, and the notion that that principle can be safely preserved in a Calvinistic system. As the Zwinglian doctrine was not able to work out a system or church for itself, and as I have already noticed, while speaking of the Lutherans and Calvinists on the continent, how faith in the Bible, which was the strongest element in that doctrine, fared under the protection of those who put it forward as their exclusive profession, I may here close my remarks upon pure Protestantism. Our next duty is to trace the characteristics of that system, of which Zwinglism has often been called the parent, and in which, as we have already seen, all the Protestant systems in the last century showed a tendency to merge.